Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is June 5th, 2023, and I'm delighted to be here with Yusuf Munayyer and Emma Salzberg to talk about the fight against anti-Semitism and the simultaneous fight against the uses of anti-Semitism accusations to silence and undermine critics of Israel and advocates for Palestinian rights. I will have full bios for Yusuf and Emma in the show notes, but just very quickly, Yusuf Munayyer is head of the Palestine-Israel program and senior fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Emma Salzberg serves as U.S. Strategic Campaigns Director for Diaspora Alliance, promoting understanding of how anti-Semitism works and how to fight it while protecting democratic values. So just as real quick context, we are gathering today basically because a little over a week ago, President Biden issued his U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. There'll be a link in the show notes to all those related documents. So, that obviously has sparked a lot of discussion. For folks who are not familiar with the Foundation for Middle East Peace's work around anti-Semitism, you may be asking, why is FMEP covering the U.S. national security strategy to counter anti-Semitism? And here I just want to remind listeners and viewers that in recent years, there has been an ongoing campaign seeking to exploit concerns about rising anti-Semitism in the US and around the world as a pretext for formally redefining the very concept of anti-Semitism to include and indeed center on and prioritize criticism of Israel and advocacy for Palestinian rights and expressions of Palestinian identity and of course, anti-Zionism. Specifically, this is the battle around what is known as the working definition of anti-Semitism that was formulated by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or as most people call it, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which I just call IHRA, who's not my great uncle. It is this definition. So IHRA is the redefinition of anti-Semitism. It conflates criticism of Israel and Zionism with anti-Semitism, and this redefinition has been used in the US and abroad already to target Palestinian rights activists and critics of Israeli policies. We often refer to this as the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And because of it, it has compelled FMEP, which is deeply engaged in this topic, both as a funder and in our own work and our original research, to do a lot on the topic. We focus on it with podcasts and webinars and research, and there'll be links to that in the show notes as well. So we're going to dive right in. In the first round of questions, I want us to just focus, Emma and Yusuf, narrowly on the text. We can get into, how we think it's being interpreted or implemented further on, but I think it's important for people to understand what the text says and what it doesn't say. So Yusuf, I want to actually start with you. And actually, I want to build some background into this. So can you start off by explaining why the conflation of criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism in the IHRA definition text and interpretation is so problematic? And I also want you to talk about alternatives that have been proposed to the IHRA definition. There's a lot of debate with the national strategy, whether it would or wouldn't include reference to other definitions. It ended up including a reference to the Nexus document, which is another definition. There's also the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, the JDA. Can you talk about the concerns about even these competing definitions from the perspective of Palestinians?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and thanks for having this conversation, having me here. When we spend time in the weeds, looking at the language of the different definitions, how this word or that word can be interpreted, how it can be applied, the different variations, the different examples, et cetera, it becomes kind of easy to lose track of the bigger picture, which I think is far more important. We have often heard anti-Semitism described as the world's oldest hatred. And I'm not sure that's exactly true. It's probably misogyny, but we will just go with that characterization. And it's obviously been around for a very long time. And a number of the organizations who supported the adoption of this definition, the IHRA definition, their very reason for being has been to combat anti-Semitism, or at least so they say. And many of them have been around for decades, some of them for a century. And yet the argument that they're making today, these organizations that have been around fighting the world's oldest hatred for 100 years, is that it's impossible to fight anti-Semitism without adopting this new definition, which is barely old enough to go to college today. What is this all about? Why is this happening now? Why the sudden effort to redefine anti-Semitism, and a variety of different redefinitions of anti-Semitism all coming at the same time? This is, I think, the central question here, and the reason why it's important to understand how it impacts Palestinians. Um, you know, when the first Intifada began, and the world was changing all around Israel, Palestine. Israel and Zionism more broadly was thrown into a major legitimacy crisis. And people started asking questions about who these Palestinians are, what their plight is, and whether or not what Israel is doing to them is legitimate, particularly among Western audiences, which Israel relies on heavily for support. That legitimacy crisis was largely mitigated by something called the peace process that provided a horizon, that provided an answer, if not an immediate answer, a longer term answer for how to address this question. When that collapsed very catastrophically in and around the year 2000, the legitimacy crisis around Zionism began to reemerge, especially as it became clear to more and more observers, again, in the West in particular, that the idea of a two-state solution, the idea of this horizon, was now impossible to achieve. And so what we began to see was growing criticism of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, more and more people hearing from and understanding Palestinians, and once again, the recentering of this crisis of Zionism, which had sold itself to Western audiences as this, as this effort to have a Jewish and democratic state. But the reality on the ground, of course, was one that was very different. And as Israel continued to shift to the right, that crisis in legitimacy became more extreme. And so what became necessary, I think, to do at that point, from the perspective of those who are seeking to defend the legitimacy of Zionism, is to change the way we talk about Zionism, or change the way we are allowed to talk about Zionism. And a major effort began to take place. Again, a lot of these definitions are only, a couple decades old, and really did not pick up until after 2005. When we saw, of course, global civil society demanding accountability for Israel's violation of Palestinian human rights with the BDS call, and so many more efforts internationally to demand accountability. That's what these definitions are about. They're about changing what we're allowed to talk about when it comes to Zionism. And for Palestinians, of course, being able to speak frankly about what Zionism means to them is central to talking about their experiences. You cannot, as a Palestinian, talk about your experience without talking about how Zionism has impacted your lives and the lives of everybody around you and in your society. So this is an effort, again, to change what we're allowed to say, precisely because it's become so difficult for supporters of Zionism to defend it, given the realities on the ground.
Thank you. And that's really great framing for this whole conversation. Emma, I want to come to you. And as I put in my slightly premature introduction, I want to talk about the actual text now of the document that was issued a little over a week ago. So can you talk about how the strategy of the Biden administration deals with the whole question of defining anti-Semitism? And feel free to get into the weeds a little bit here.
Yes, I will be reading directly from the text, not long from now, but I also just want to note at the top that part of what makes this document such a jarring read for people who spend a lot of time in the intra-Jewish communal debates about anti-Semitism is precisely that definitions have such a minor role to play in this document. On page 13 of the document, right before the first set of strategic goals, what the White House does is write its own definition of anti-Semitism in a paragraph. And I'm going to read it because it's pretty good. You know, we can have our quibbles, but the White House says, anti-Semitism is a stereotypical and negative perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred of Jews. It is prejudice, bias, hostility, discrimination, or violence against Jews for being Jews, or Jewish institutions or property for being Jewish or perceived as Jewish. Anti-Semitism can manifest as a form of racial, religious, national origin, and/or ethnic discrimination, bias, or hatred, or a combination thereof. However, anti-Semitism is not simply a form of prejudice or hate. It is also a pernicious conspiracy theory that often features myths about Jewish power and control. So like on one foot, you could do worse. And then the most interesting part for the political fight over this is the next paragraph, which says, there are several definitions of anti-Semitism, which serve as valuable tools to raise awareness and increase understanding of anti-Semitism. The most prominent is the non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism adopted in 2016 by the 31 member states of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, which the United States has embraced. In addition, the administration welcomes and appreciates the Nexus document and notes other such efforts. And it goes on, this is a paragraph of its own, one line. The focus of this national strategy is on actions is underlined, to counter anti-Semitism. So, and then the rest of the document is in fact focused on actions to counter anti-Semitism. So one way to read this national strategy is as a statement that says, hey, this definitional fight is a distraction. This is a real blow, right, to the campaign to ask governments and entities of all other sorts, Lara, you know all too well, to adopt the IHRA definition into their official policies. IHRA proponents note that it is the consensus, that it is the gold standard, that it is the only definition that works. These are all direct quotes from IHRA proponents. And the White House's simple statement that there are several definitions of anti-Semitism is a real blow to that assertion of consensus. And the fact that they noted that they welcomed and appreciated another definition and noted the existence of more is a blow to the inevitability, the perception of inevitability that the IHRA campaign really trades on. So,
great. Okay, we're going to get into all of that deeper in just a little bit. Yusuf, before we get past the text, I want to dig a little deeper. So with that understanding of how anti-Semitism is or is not defined in the text, I want to ask you to zoom out. Israel is still mentioned in the plan relatively few times in a 60-page strategy. When I say few, I say relative to the amount of effort that was put into trying to center Israel by advocates on the outside, but it is there. I believe Zionism, the term Zionism isn't mentioned at all. Can you talk about how the text of the strategy overall deals with or doesn't deal with Israel in your view? And what do you make of the administration's approach that Emma just described of referencing IHRA and Nexus and other definitions, and even offering its own, with its own, in contrast to IHRA and Nexus, not in any way involving Israel or Palestinians, or as we see, even these definitions that are seen as more positive and not trying to be weaponized, but still centering somewhat on Palestinians. But can you just talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think we need to keep in mind that there's a difference between the text of the actual document that the White House put out, and then the ways in which that text, and specifically the actions which it calls for, and I think it calls for some 100 different actions, right, to combat anti-Semitism, how those actions are actually going to be enforced and how they're going to actually be carried out. And I think that there is a lot of gray area there, and a lot of opportunity within that gray area for those who want to see weaponized definitions of anti-Semitism directed at Palestine advocacy. There's a lot of space there for that to happen. Okay, so I think we need to be honest about that outside of the text, that, you know, whatever one thinks of the text, it is in the implementation by various agencies, where acts of repression against Palestine advocacy can take place, regardless to whether there's a mention of any definition or an embrace of a particular definition at all, right? You know, I think that that part is really important. At the same time, you know, the White House was clearly under a lot of pressure from a number of different voices who supported the inclusion of the IHRA definition and the adoption of the IHRA definition by the White House as the sole legitimate definition that is recognized by the Jewish community. And I think that, you know, clearly supporters of that perspective didn't get what they wanted here. They not only have wanted to put forward this idea that there is consensus around this definition, which there obviously is not, but that it is the only way of thinking about this. And I think, you know, prior to this strategy, actually the only definition that the US government had taken an official position towards, positive position towards, was the IHRA definition. And now, with this White House strategy, we actually see them saying, well, there are several useful definitions, right? And we can parse the language and talk about the exact words they use to talk about each definition, and the fact that they came up with their own definition, as Emma pointed out, or the fact that they mentioned the IHRA definition but didn't mention the very problematic examples that are often used to weaponize the definition against Palestine activism. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is, of course, anti-Semitism is a very real problem. And the White House did, I think, in part, did not want their effort to address anti-Semitism, which they, of course, wanted to be taken seriously, to end up becoming known simply for this political fight, and also end up getting tied up in endless First Amendment challenges in the courts. When the reality on the ground here in the United States is that we do have a really dangerous ideology that is leading violent people to attack Jews in the United States in ways that we have not seen prior to recent years. So I think from the perspective of White House administrators, there's a political fight, but there's also the question of how is this actually going to be useful? And I don't think it's going to be useful if it becomes weaponized, certainly not to those who really want to combat anti-Semitism. And I think that's something that those who wanted to make sure this works in the White House probably had in mind.
Excellent. That's a perfect lead into my next question for Emma, which is certainly, how did this happen, right? So the pro-IHRA crowd, and here we're talking about really powerful, effective organizations, the ADL, the AJC, the Jewish Federations, the Conference of Presidents. We know, I mean, I'm not attributing intent here. We know what they wanted because they were very clearly on the record in tweets and in statements and in articles. They wanted an absolute, unequivocal, and exclusive endorsement of IHRA as the basis of US policy. So that's it. And I mean, I think we saw once the news started leaking that it might include a passing reference to Nexus, you got a sense that maybe they would tolerate that as long as IHRA is at the center. Instead, as you laid out, what they got instead was basically a brand new Biden definition that doesn't mention Israel. It's actually a pretty good definition. It's pretty close to the one that I articulate when I've been asked for years, what is anti-Semitism? And they got, as we've said, they got language where you get the reference to IHRA is there's only once. It's a passive voice reference about what's been done before. It's described as the most prominent of several definitions. And I've seen articles saying that proves that they're centering. And I'm like, most prominent is like saying, well, what's the most important, what do you think is the best Jewish organization? You say, well, AIPAC is the biggest. That is not saying it's the best. You're saying it's the biggest. And IHRA is the most prominent because millions of dollars have been spent for years to push it out in front. So basically, I mean, it's a value neutral description. So how did this happen with all of the lobbying, all the work went into this? How did IHRA end up not at the center of the strategy? Aside from the fact that logically it shouldn't have been if you really care about fighting anti-Semitism, as Yusuf said, but politically, how do you think this happened?
Yeah, it's the question of the moment. I think I want to pick up on some of what Yusuf was just saying and point out that official name of the interagency, the like official government entity that put together this strategy is actually called the Interagency Group to Counter Antisemitism, Islamophobia, and Related Forms of Discrimination and Bias. And their quote unquote first order of business was developing a national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, but they were actually officially tasked with countering anti-Semitism alongside other forms of bias and discrimination. And so with that mandate, taking that seriously, and then also hearing the input of civil rights groups like the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center, from Muslim groups, Arab groups, as well as progressive Jews and liberal Jews, really demonstrating that there was a clear civil rights case against IHRA being articulated across that swath of stakeholders, and that the perception of Jewish unity behind the IHRA definition was actually not really the case.
Excellent. So, and I will say, I mean, this is something your organization has done a lot of work around, and I would point people, if they want to see the kind of language that comes out of the groups that Emma is talking about. I think a really good example is the letter that was submitted. It was led by the ACLU to the American Bar Association last year, pushing back against IHRA. So there you saw a huge cross-communal letter framing out the various objections, and I think it was a really effective way. Yusuf, I want to come back, and Emma mentioned Arab American groups. I want to ask you to talk specifically, if you can, about how you see the engagement of Arab American groups and groups from that community that are focused on Palestinian rights. And here, I actually want to bring this out both because I think it's an important factor in terms of the relationships, the administration, and the credibility of these groups. I also want to point out that one of the key talking points that's been used, that was seized on immediately to attack the strategy, was that in the second part of the strategy, which talks about what they will do, there's a section on an organizational effort, commitments that have been made across the civil society sector to fight anti-Semitism, including commitments made by the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE. It is one of the groups that is quote, made commitments to counter anti-Semitism and build cross-community solidarity by organizations across the sector, the private sector, civil society, religious and multi-faith communities, and higher education. I mean, the mere presence of CARE on that list has been used by some to say the entire thing is obviously a sham. I will also say that I was on a briefing call with the ADL last week, where Jonathan Greenblatt said that just proves that CARE has adopted the IHRA definition, because his framing is that, and we'll get to in a second, that they have adopted the IHRA definition. But can you talk about the Arab American group's engagement on this?
Yeah, and I just want to make one point about the previous question that you had asked to Emma. You know, I think given the amount of the sort of full court press the pro IHRA crowd, as you put it, made to try to ensure that the IHRA definition was the only definition that was included and was the quote unquote gold standard. I think because of that, and obviously because of a lot of their impact historically on these issues, there was the assumption that it was going to be hard for the White House to say no. It was going to be hard for the White House to do anything but what these major organizations were calling for. And I think there was a bit of surprise when we saw that wasn't the case, right? And that might seem surprising, but at the same time, I think it's important to remember that one of the reasons this entire strategy of trying to shut down the conversation around Palestine is seen as necessary by these groups is precisely because of the limits of their influence, and precisely because they are no longer able to shape the conversation to the extent that they were previously. And I think that, you know, as important and as influential as some of these groups may be, they aren't the last word on this issue all the time. And I think more and more we are seeing the limits of the influence of some of these organizations in recent years. When it comes to Arab American groups and Muslim American groups, it's interesting that you say that about Jonathan Greenblatt on the recent conference call. Makes me wonder if he's now taken care off of his blacklist, because I think he put them on a list of groups that were akin to right-wing extremists or whatever else. The photo inverse of neo-Nazis, or however he described them like a year ago. So it's glad to see that he's coming around. But look, the reality is that you can't fight any type of racism without fighting every type of racism. And I think that's one of the things that is a fundamental weakness among the pro-IHRA crowd. What they're saying is the only way you can fight anti-Semitism is if you turn a blind eye towards apartheid in Israel and don't say anything about that. And that's just not the way that you fight any type of bigotry. And I always go back to the example at the Tree of Life synagogue. The murderer in question there is on trial right now. And when he went to attack that synagogue, part of the ideology that was driving him was the fact that he thought that Jews were part of this big conspiracy theory to weaken American society by bringing in brown Muslim refugees. And unless you can understand the ways that these forms of hatred are connected, and I think it's vital to bring in the voices of impacted communities to do that, then there's no way that you can really combat these strains of anti-Semitism. At the same time, especially given the demands around the IHRA definition, you can't ignore the voices of people who are going to be affected by that definition when it is weaponized by so many of the groups who want to weaponize it. And specifically here, I'm talking about people who speak up for the rights of Palestinians, and the people who are targets of this weaponization are very often young Muslim women. And so I think it's important that the voices of communities who are impacted by this have a voice in this conversation. And as Emma said, this interagency group was not only focused on anti-Semitism, but importantly framed it as part of an effort to fight various forms of hatred.
Thank you. And that's, again, a good segue into what I want to be talking about next. And I want to mention young Muslim women. I want to bring into this the concept of anti-Palestinian racism as we look at the different kinds of racism and discrimination that need to be fought. And before we just put a pin in that, that's part of this question. But Yusuf, I want to stay with you for a second. The strategy, as you said it right from the outset, includes many commitments and objectives and calls for action, including by Congress. And I spent a lot of time focused on Congress. An optimistic take might be that given what's in the actual text and what it doesn't say with respect to IHRA and criticism of Israel, this strategy should put a damper on the efforts to see the formalization, adoption, put in the enforcement by law of the IHRA definition against Palestinian rights activists and free speech. A more pessimistic take, and I'd argue a more realistic one, is that IHRA backers, many of whom right out of the gate basically came out saying, we 100% welcome this strategy and its embrace of the IHRA definition, and we're just going to pretend that's what it says, and that they're going to seek to leverage this mischaracterization to escalate their own efforts and intensify the policies of trying to police and delegitimize free speech with the conflation of criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And we're already seeing that. And I'm going to give two examples. One is last week, we already saw the introduction of legislation in Congress that seeks to put the IHRA definition into law. And two, it seeks to put it into law in the context of the very public hysteria that has been generated around a graduation speech given by a young Yemeni woman at CUNY Law, in which she leveled some very harsh criticism of Israeli policies and Israeli actions. argument. She articulated things that I think make a lot of supporters of Israel deeply, deeply uncomfortable. I would argue none of it is anti-Semitic. They're clearly arguments against the state of Israel and its policies. It's not anything about Jews and Jewish identity. But we basically now have the entire organized community rallying against her. We have death threats against her. The ADL call I mentioned focused in part on that. I believe in a question that was bookended with the Tree of Life massacre, which was pretty stunning. So can you talk about how you anticipate this playing out and the concerns that you may have? And you've mentioned some of them already, on how efforts to implement the strategy, using the strategy now as a weapon and a shield, may impact advocacy for Palestinian rights and expressions of Palestinian identity.
Right. Look, I think that the people who and the groups for whom this strategy of weaponizing the IHRA definition was something that they were supporting prior to the strategy, this strategy is not going to change a whole lot in their approach, regardless to what it said. They were committed to it and are going to continue doing so. And that's why, regardless to what the actual language of the strategy is around the IHRA definition, even if it is very different than what they called for in the days just before the strategy was released, they're going to pretend it is exactly what they wanted and use that as an opportunity to claim that there is continued momentum behind their campaign to not only proliferate this definition, but also, importantly, have it enforced in the way that they want to see it enforced. So I'm not sure, you could imagine a scenario, of course, where the White House did exactly what these groups wanted and what they were calling for, and didn't mention alternative definitions, and said that, we see anti-Semitism purely through the prism of IHRA, and there's no other way to define it, and so on and so forth. And I think if they did that, obviously the pro-IHRA campaigners would be even more excited and would feel that they had more wind at their backs as they continue this campaign to proliferate it. But they were going to continue on with this campaign regardless to what the White House strategy said. So I do think the fact that it did not take this wholehearted embrace of their position is something of a setback for them, especially given the importance of the United States internationally, its bilateral relationships with so many of the other countries that are considering adopting or implementing this definition, as well as other international organizations. So I think it is important that there is a distinction there, but it probably wasn't going to change a whole lot of what these pro-IHRA campaigners were doing. My biggest concern is really with the implementation of this thing. Because at the end of the day, it's not going to be the people who were part of this, working group that the White House put together. It's going to be a wide range of functionaries at various levels of government who are going to be called upon to enforce this strategy. And there are going to be many pro-IHRA campaigners who are going to demand that they enforce it within their agencies, within their institutions, in the way that they want to see it enforced, to direct it against the people that they want to direct it against. And I think, we know how this is going to play out, or how they want it to play out. And the speech at CUNY is a perfect example. There's a reason why the student speaker at CUNY is being used as a poster person by the pro-IHRA campaigners. And it is because they can rely on existing racism and Islamophobia for traction when making their calls to action. There's a reason why Representative Ilhan Omar gets the kind of attacks that she does. But Representative Betty McCollum, who happens to be a white woman from Michigan and was a leader in putting out legislation around Israel's treatment of child prisoners, the attacks against her, which we sometimes hear is blood libel against Israel for saying that they attack children or what have you. Those don't seem to stick against her in the way that those kinds of smears tend to stick against people who are identifiably Muslim, and particularly women, who are often living at the intersection of so many different types of bigotry and hatred, making them really the easiest targets out there. So I think, I expect that there is going to be an intensification of this campaign, and it's really going to focus on how to push institutions and people at various levels to adopt the definition and the enforcement of it in the ways that they would like to see.
Thanks. And I agree with you. That's my biggest concern as well. I would note for people who pay attention to these sorts of things, much like the attacks on Congresswoman Omar and Congresswoman Tlaib, the attacks on the speaker from the CUNY speaker have been bipartisan. My roundup from last week rounds it up the statements from members of Congress, with the lead coming from Richie Torres, and then people just, and it is absolutely bipartisan. It is really something to see. Emma, I want to sort of ask you a similar question, but it's like a slightly different tack. And I know you were also, I think, on the ADL call that I listened to last week. One of the things that was striking in that call, having, as someone who had read the document and parsed the words, was the positions taken or the views expressed by President Biden's special envoy for anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, who, as far as I heard it, appeared to very much weigh in with and bolster the framing offered by the ADL's Jonathan Greenblatt, suggesting that this document is a wholehearted embrace of IHRA, absolutely 100%, and there's nothing else to it. With that as context, and you being someone who is engaged in conversations with people, I think, in the administration going up to this point, can you talk about your own hopes and concerns with respect to implementation of the strategy? Are there things you're particularly worried about and hopeful for, given what you know about where different parts of the administration are on this? And how do you see the Biden administration? How should we understand the Biden administration when you have, on the one hand, this document coming out of a process, and I say as a former diplomat, every word in this document was carefully considered. There's not a word here that is an accident. They didn't accidentally not wholeheartedly embrace IHRA, right? It's not an accident that the one mentioned is passive. But how do you see the Biden administration when there appears to be a disagreement within Biden officialdom about what it is meant to say and how it should be implemented?
Yeah, great question. I regrettably also was on that webinar last week, and an additional piece of context that I think is useful here, that sort of explains some of the seeming like incongruities in the White House's paragraph about definitions. Like, what does it mean that the United States has embraced IHRA if we're also saying that it has not adopted IHRA? What that's talking about is that the State Department adopted the IHRA definition for its own purposes during the Obama administration. And that was something that progressive Jewish groups asked the Biden administration to reconsider in 2021, not to drop IHRA, but to add Nexus and the JDA to its list of educational resources that it uses to train diplomats and that kind of thing. And Secretary of State Tony Blinken emphatically rejected that demand. And so what we're seeing since the release of the strategy, and so what that means is that Deborah Lipstadt, who is the administration's highest ranking official, who is explicitly tasked with monitoring anti-Semitism, but whose official remit does not include domestic policy at all. She's a State Department official. Her department's official policy and now the White House's official policy are not perfectly aligned. There's differences there, there's tension there. And what we have seen, not only in that ADL webinar, but even on her own Twitter account, since the release of the strategy, is that Ambassador Lipstadt has aligned herself with critics of the strategy, proponents of the IHRA definition, including quite far-right Israel advocates, if you go look at her Twitter timeline. And I'm very concerned about that. I think that's deeply worrisome. And that's sort of a major political concern. And beyond Israel and discourse about Palestine, which this document really tries to push us to go, and I'm happy to go there. I would say my biggest top line concern about the document is just that over and over, it encourages closer ties between Jewish communities and law enforcement. And like, that's not surprising as it is a government document, but feels very important to register up top that that is not a strategy that I think is going to keep Jewish communities safe. And there are also sort of big areas that will be sites of contestation under education. So it's been very interesting to follow the other area in which the United States federal government has nominally adopted the IHRA definition, which is the Department of Education under a executive order signed by Donald Trump in 2019, Executive Order 13899, which the Biden administration has been engaged in rulemaking on for the last about year and a half. And that rulemaking was delayed in December of 2022. And instead of a rule, which would be basically like a formalizing of that executive order into policy, the Biden Department of Education instead released a fact sheet, which does not mention IHRA at all, and which basically reaffirms the administration's existing commitment to protecting Jewish students alongside students of all religions from discrimination based on their real or perceived, I believe it's ethnic characteristics, but that language might not be exactly correct. But it's basically, they want to protect Jews from anti-Semitism. They don't want to promote IHRA. And what happened on the date of the national strategy release is that the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights also released a Dear Colleague letter, which is a sort of stronger, it's like not quite a regulation, but a stronger sort of statement of how they're going to be enforcing the policy. That again, that doubles down on the sort of framework of the fact sheet, does not refer to IHRA, refers to the executive order in pointing you to the fact sheet. So this is a pretty clear set of signals from the Office for Civil Rights that they don't want to be enforcing IHRA, and that they've kind of like held their non-IHRA anti-Semitism policy until the national strategy came out. But that fight is still ongoing. That rulemaking process is technically still open. So that's something watching. As well, there's language in the strategy about ethnic studies, which is not really like going to be, especially I think, a priority of the right-wing organizations at the K-12 level. And that is a really tough, it's a tough terrain because that policy is made in such a fragmented, geographically dispersed way. But you know, it's those ongoing attacks on ethnic studies have been part of a right-wing, a broad right-wing attack on public education. And it's very concerning to see right-wing establishment Jewish groups gearing up to sort of take their part in that broader assault on public education. I wanted to also pick up on something Yusuf said on this kind of note and say that the attacks on the CUNY law commencement speaker certainly draw on existing wells of racism and Islamophobia. And another piece of why that is so potent, why these attacks are so potent and so appealing, is that they also draw on existing desires to defund CUNY, right? That this is like part of attacks on institutions that this sort of political coalition does not actually want to exist or to exist in their current forms. And as far as like, there are positive things, encouraging things in the strategy as well. There's some very interesting language about non-punitive approaches to victims of hate violence that I would really encourage folks to look at and consider wielding some pressure around using that. And all of these, another way to think about these upcoming attacks on college campuses, on K-12 education, is also as an opportunity for progressives, particularly progressive Jews, to organize, to plug in. Get involved with campaigns for ethnic studies, for example, in your local context, and build relationships and build solidarity that way, which is, again, another pillar of this strategy. So hoping it can encourage, just more sort of cross-communal connections and cross-communal organizing.
Terrific. And just to mention, on the ethnic studies question, for people who don't follow this stuff obsessively, Israel and how ethnic studies programs deal with Israel and with, Palestinian ethnicity. And this has already been a huge topic. Just Google California ethnic studies. I would also say on the education piece of it, and this actually, goes into the question of what the remand of various U.S. officials is. I mean, again, on the ADL call last week, I think one of the moments that took me the most by surprise was when Deborah Lipstadt was giving an example of what she saw as anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, or activism critical of Israel being unquestionably anti-Semitism. And she articulated an example where she described an attack on Jewish students at GW celebrating Sukkot by critics of Israel. And it was quite a striking example to give, because that isn't what happened. What she's describing is a well-documented case where you had activists protesting the appearance of a former IDF official at GW Hillel, which time-wise actually coincided with Sukkot, but it wasn't about Sukkot. It wasn't an attack on a Jewish celebration. It wasn't any of those things. And on a conference call with 1,800 people, or a webinar, she put that out there as fact. Which I found incredibly troubling. So I think how this, the implementation question, the intentions is something that I think a lot of us are reasonably worried about. Before we get on to the last section, which is where I'm going to ask you to be a little more maybe optimistic, Yusuf, as we're talking about what things look like going forward, I do want to take a second for our audience and look back. Defenders of IHRA always note that there's a caveat in the definition that says, quote, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic, in effect suggesting that the IHRA definition is absolutely not a blunt instrument. How in the world could anyone say so unless they are anti-Semites or trying to defend anti-Semitism, and that it is never, ever used or going to be used to quash criticism of Israel and activism related to Israel and Zionism. And when Emma was just talking about the concern about how this is implemented down the road, particularly by law enforcement, I just kept thinking about what's happening in Germany today, where the pro-IHRA crowd has effectively imbued German law enforcement with the view that Palestinians by nature are anti-Semitic, and any possible event that would bring together support for Palestinian rights is just an opportunity to be anti-Semitic, and all symbols of Palestinian identity are anti-Semitic. I mean, that's now just part and parcel of the law enforcement approach in Germany. So, can you talk about how IHRA, like in Germany, is already being used as a blunt instrument against activists, against academics, against free speech?
Yeah, you're right. I think one of the big challenges is a lot of people don't really understand how a collection of words on paper can end up silencing, intimidating, coercing, and repressing activists. How do we get from a definition to that act of repression? And there is a process, and it is that process that people, I think, have the least understanding of, unless you've been subjected to it or you're following this issue very, very closely. Usually the way that this plays out is that a campaign is launched against a particular target, whether it's a student speaker at a commencement or a Palestinian student group or a employee at a company or what have you. This institution where this target is affiliated may or may not have adopted the IHRA definition. But either way, this campaign will approach the institution and say, look, according to the most prominent definition of anti-Semitism, this student on your campus who said free Palestine from the river to the sea is denying, example A, subsection B of the IHRA definition. And therefore, unless you take strict action against this student, you are going to be enabling anti-Semitism on your campus. Now, any administrator would receive such a complaint and obviously want to take it seriously. And would then probably, as often is the case, launch an investigation into the student or into the professor or into the student group or the employee or what have you. Now this, target has to suddenly defend themselves against a investigation. And, let's be honest, most of these institutions who are enforcing this policy don't understand the language and the specifics and the nuance around the conversation of Israel-Palestine. The vast majority of people don't. And so they're going to look for support and expertise to help them understand how this definition is to be applied and interpreted. And lo and behold, the people making the complaint or their friends have a whole list of experts that can help you understand how this should be interpreted and implied and applied. And so, this is the process through which institutions end up using this definition to take action against individuals for perfectly constitutionally protected speech. That's how this happens most of the time. It's how it has happened. There are cases like this that are ongoing now. And again, whether an institution has or has not adopted this definition, it doesn't stop the pro-IHRA campaigners, the lawfare groups, and this broader network of repression actors from pressing those institutions to silence the students or professors or employees who are affiliated with them for speaking up about the rights of Palestinians and about the problems with Zionism and so on. And the case of Germany, I think, is a really great example of where this can go, where any symbol of Palestinian expression becomes equated with some sort of anti-Semitic expression, to the point where keffiyehs and Palestinian flags are being taken away from people at marches in the streets by the police because they see these as anti-Semitic expressions. I mean, if you were to design a strategy to silence dissent against Israeli policy, this is probably what an effective strategy would look like, is the German example. And I think that supporters of the IHRA definition and these campaigners would like to see many more countries look the way that Germany does when it comes to silencing Palestine activism. And I think that's the direction that they would like to push things.
And I'll just also add, for people who think this is hypothetical, the ongoing case at George Washington University against a professor named Lara Sheehy, Palestinian American professor, you can read the Stand With Us complaint against her. And it basically opens with the IHRA definition. And then it says, applying this definition, everything in the complaint is based on the Israel elements of the IHRA definition. There's nothing else. If you don't have that definition, there is no complaint. So it's not remotely hypothetical. Emma, did you want to jump in here? I have a question for you, but you can jump in first. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, can I just add one more thing on this? I think you mentioned, Laura, that these proponents of the IHRA definition say, well, look, it says criticism is fine, and how can it be used as a weapon in that case? The same people who say that at one moment, when you look at them speaking about this issue in other contexts amongst each other, in meetings with Israeli government officials, with on webinars with other pro-IHRA campaigners, they talk about how they want to use this definition to go after people who practice BDS, to go after people in the campus environment, and so on and so forth. So they're actually quite transparent, if you look into it, about the way in which they want this definition to be utilized and to be weaponized.
Yeah, to directly respond to that last piece, the thing that I always think about with regard to like these specific examples is that it says criticism of Israel that is similar to criticism leveled against any other country cannot be anti-Semitic. There's no other country that is the Jewish state, so you have an out. You always have an out if you're applying that example.
I call that the all lives mattering of criticism of Israel. You can, it's anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I wanted to just say a little bit, I'm actually speaking to you from Germany right now. I'm in Berlin on a staff retreat with my coworkers. And our Germany team was really excited at the outcome of this document. For the blow that it poses to the campaign for IHRA, but also they noted something that I think is like not a small thing and something that we should really hold on to, which is that not everywhere in this document, but over and over, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry are presented alongside each other. And what I'm told from my German colleagues is that in the German context, that is unthinkable, that anti-Semitism is really deeply, culturally, legally exceptionalized. And that part of what we see out of this document is that that is not the approach that is fully being taken here. And there are real openings to apply some of the logic that is intended to protect Jewish students from discrimination, also to Palestinians. I actually want to point to something in the text, and this is like a little bit of a, I'm not sure if this reading is like too cute or trolling, but I think it has some potential interest. So I'm going to point us to it, which is on page 40. I was talking about addressing strategic goal 3.4, addressing anti-Semitism in K-12 schools and on college campuses. And the second paragraph down says, on college campuses, Jewish students, educators, and administrators have been derided, ostracized, and sometimes discriminated against because of their actual or perceived views on Israel. All students, educators, and administrators should feel safe and free from violence, harassment, and intimidation on their campuses. Far too many do not have this sense of security because of their actual or perceived views on Israel. Protecting actual or perceived views on Israel is like not, that's new language as far as I can tell. But what I want to offer is that that could also be applied to anti-Zionist students, to Palestinian students who should not feel unsafe or harassed or intimidated because of their views on Israel. Just an offering. That's obviously, I think it's pretty clear from the rest of the paragraph that may not have been how it was intended, but that is how it is written. And so I basically I want to just sort of offer that there is the German example is horrifying, and we have resources to stop ourselves from getting there.
Excellent. Okay, so we're running over time. We try not to ever go over an hour on a podcast. So for listeners, I apologize, but I have one more question for each of you, and be as brief as you want or not if there's more to say. So Emma, I wanted looking ahead, because you're involved in you're continuing, right? This is what you do. So how do you see progressives taking this, what is at least technically on language, a victory? It's a victory in that the other side didn't get everything they wanted, at least. And building momentum to carry forward into the battles that, as we have just been discussing, are clearly to come. What kinds of pushback do you think will be necessary with respect to the efforts to continue to weaponize IHRA? And where do you see that pushback coming from? You are muted.
Oh no, dragging us out even longer. I don't want to say too much. I know we're over time. But I think that part of what is so remarkable about the tantrum that the right-wing organizations threw over the sole adoption of IHRA in being the sort of measure of success or failure of this document is that it demonstrates that that is actually what this process was about for them. And this is a moment for progressives and liberal Jews who actually have a vision of what it looks like for Jews to live in safety alongside our neighbors across many lines of difference, to be heartened that like we are the ones who are serious about anti-Semitism. We are the ones who want to be living in safety, and to be inspired to perhaps join some organizing in defense of your local public schools or libraries, fighting against repression, both based on criticism of Israel and also just the broader attack on basic freedoms that we are seeing in our country right now.
Thanks. And I'll just add to that, reading the text, I recognize, I think it's clear how the other side is going to try to interpret it and implement it. I do feel, as someone who's often attacked on this issue, that whether or not that was the intent, the Biden administration has left us in a better position to defend ourselves. if before this strategy came out, the only language that had been in any way formally adopted by the administration was the State Department's embrace of IHRA and the executive order in the Education Department, we now have a formal statement of the Biden administration that basically says its own definition, which I'm willing to hang my hat on, and the rest of them are part of a basket of definitions that have value. I feel like, if I have to ever, make my case in court, they've left me in a much stronger position to defend myself and push back against what the other side is doing. Yusuf, I want to give you the last word. And again, this is sort of the looking ahead. And actually, I want to look to you for your practical advice. So one of the pillars of this strategy is the building of, quote, cross-community solidarity and collective action to counter hate, which sounds awesome. And as we've talked about before, it doesn't exceptionalize anti-Semitism. It frames it as akin to other forms of hate, including racism. It talks about Islamophobia. It talks about creating a, quote, united front against anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of hate. And then it talks about what it's going to do. And it's got, like we talked about, this long list of groups that are supposed to be involved, from, oddly enough, the NBA to the ADL and the AJC, and then the Southern Poverty Law Center. What sort of guidance would you offer to organizations and to individuals as they're asked to fulfill these commitments in coalition with these groups that may have very, very different agendas? And here I'm thinking especially the groups which are focused specifically on civil rights, human rights, and are a part of the Arab American, Muslim American fabric of this country. When they're working in coalition, how do they engage effectively so that they are partners in the fight against anti-Semitism and hate, and also standing up against this effort to push the commitments in a different direction?
I think the only thing that I would say is that there is simply no way to fight anti-Semitism or any other form of bigotry or hate in isolation. You cannot claim to be fighting anti-Semitism while turning a blind eye towards or supporting discrimination against Palestinians or any other group of people, whether that is Palestinians under Israeli rule, or Palestinian Americans here in the West Bank here in the United States exercising their constitutional right to speak out against Zionism and against Israeli policy. And I think, there are probably going to be a wide range of groups who may, join in this effort. If this becomes an effort that is aimed at, or if certain groups within this effort want to aim it at silencing Palestine activism, that is going to, number one, target Palestinians and those who speak up for them. Number two, take the focus off where it should be, which is combating anti-Semitism and those who are genuinely responsible for it. As we know from all of the data, including the ADL's data, this is primarily a phenomenon that exists on the right today. Again, gives a free pass to those individuals on the right and these right-wing extremists. And in doing so, actually makes Jewish Americans and everyone else less safe. I think it depends on what kind of effort this is going to be. If it is going to be a genuine effort to combat anti-Semitism, I think there's opportunity for success, and there's an opportunity for actual coalition work together. If this becomes an effort to combat Palestinians and those who speak up for them, then I think it's only going to get as far as that, and is not actually going to tackle anti-Semitism, and probably will not have a very successful coalition effort behind it at all.
Thank you. That is a great place to leave this. And I think this is really just the first of what will be many discussions. So thank you both, Emma and Yusuf, so much for sharing your time and your analysis today. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this extended episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content related to Israel and Palestine. And I will put a ton of pretty much everything that we mentioned here. I'll have a link for that. Please make sure you are subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and you can watch the videos of our podcast, including this one, on YouTube. All those links are also at our website. So with that, I'm Laura Friedman, signing off until the next episode of FMAP's Occupied Thoughts. Thank you both so much for joining me.